Good day and greetings. This is Dr. Charles Cotter. I'd like to welcome you to episode 6 of the HRM Strategic Performance Advisor video series. Those of you that were able to watch the preceding 5 episodes will recall that the objective of this particular video series is to provide HR professionals with a toolkit on how to graduate and upgrade, transform from a level 2 of maturity transactional to get to level 4 to become a strategic performance advisor. Therefore, the focus of episode 6, the learning thrust and the chief outcomes, is to then systematically unpack the HR governance framework and then also to introduce you to what I call the red car. These are the key components of the HR governance framework, and we'll get to that very shortly. So if I could start off with the HR governance framework, you'll see on the screen right now, there are 5 pillars of this governance framework: structure and accountability, effective counsels, philosophy and operating principles, core management activities, and performance monitoring. And these are all the foundations then of creating a very solid HR functional governance framework. And of course, I will complement this by very shortly looking at what I call the red car, which then covers the architecture of the HR governance framework.
So although the focus for this particular learning program is on HR risk management and HR auditing, just be mindful of the fact that when we talk about your HR governance framework, it's a lot more broader, it's a lot more comprehensive. And of course, when we talk about the HR governance architecture, just to make it memorable, I think you know by now, I love my 70-20-10% ratio, but I also love acronyms, and just to make it more memorable. So just to cover the complexity of the entirety of the HR governance framework, I've developed what I call the red car, R-E-D-C-A-R, which then covers the entire architecture of HR governance. So just to remind you, the first R stands for risk management, which will be the focus of the morning session. The E stands for ethics. So I think Wellington, from day one, you've been quite vocal in that regard. And this is essentially where, in this governance role, I believe we should play a vital role in terms of stimulating and cultivating an ethical leadership culture, in particular, because we know Wellington, the leaders, the senior executive management team, they are the cultural carriers. So we need to create this ethical leadership culture. And those organizations that have aligned with the King 4 report on corporate governance, you'll recall that there are 17 principles. If you review that from a corporate governance perspective, you'll see there's at least 3, maybe even 4 of the 17 principles that relate directly to HR governance, where we can make a significant role. And again, if you work through that very same governance report, you will see that the ultimate outcome is to create, one of the objectives is to create this ethical leadership culture. So I don't think we are exempt in HR. From an HR governance perspective, we are not exempt from contributing to that ethical leadership culture. I spoke about the D, and that is, of course, workforce or workplace democracy. So we spoke about employee voice. We've got to create those formal, but also those informal platforms in which employees can not only voice their grievances or their concerns. So we know we have a grievance procedure. We also have a disciplinary route that we need to take. So it's not just for those purposes, but also in terms of stimulating innovation. We said we have to create those windows of opportunity where employees can have those platforms where they can share their really smart ideas. Because let's be honest, the smartest ideas in companies, with all due respect, they do not emanate from the board. They emanate from the shop floor. So I think it's very important that we stimulate in this governance role as HR business partners, that we stimulate this workplace democracy, not just employee voice for grievances, but also performance, discipline, but also innovation. Those should be the levers. You might argue that the compliance, the C, is maybe the most important of these roles. And we know when you talk about compliance, we've got to comply with national labor legislation. We've got to comply with regulatory authorities, standards that are set within our industry. And of course, internally, we have to then also comply with your policy, your procedure, your standard operating procedures, etc. So we often fixate on compliance. I think it is a very important part, of the governance equation, but not exclusively focusing on compliance. What we're going to focus on this program later on this morning up until lunch is, of course, HR auditing. So the A stands for auditing. So I'm not going to dwell on that one because we will go through that in detail. We're going to do the diagnostics, looking at whether we comply with the best practice principles of HR auditing, but also I want us to navigate, similar to what we did with HR metrics, I also want us to navigate the three-step. I'm proposing the three-step process map for HR auditing, and that is where I will harmonize that with how we can use an HR auditing checklist as our primary HR auditing tool. We need to generate HR auditing intelligence, but again, I would suggest that you look at secondary but also tertiary toolkit. So you shouldn't just rely on the old school checklist. For me, there is no better tool, but don't be dependent on one tool. And I'd like to discuss later on this morning, I'd like to discuss what are those alternative, those secondary and also tertiary HR auditing tools. And logically, at the back end of the cycle, the second R then stands for reporting. So the human capital reporting, you need to submit your HR audit reports, you need to submit your HR risk management registers, etc. All of that needs to go to serve at the various governance committees and structures. So you should have an HR risk committee, you should have an HR audit committee, and of course, these governance structures should then hold HR accountable for maintaining, low levels of risk. So we often talk about reducing your risk liability, but also from an auditing perspective, we should be held accountable for unqualified and clean audits. I think that should always be the strategic objective. Number one, to reduce the risk liability of the organization, because I think you'll agree most organizations are very conservative with their risk appetite. We don't have Maverick mindset in that regard. We're very conservative. So I think these are very important. From each of these functions, you'd have to identify specific objectives and outcomes. So we know clearly from an auditing perspective, you want an unqualified, you want a clean HR audit. From an ethics perspective, you want to have this very conducive ethical leadership culture. From a risk management perspective, you obviously want to reduce the organizational risk liability. And from a compliance perspective, you might argue that we want to have 100% compliance with internal policy and procedure, regulatory standards within the industry. We know there are watchdogs, especially in government, that keep a very close eye. I think, Melanie, you spoke about the Competition Commission that had to approve your merger a couple of years ago. So there are certain standards, not just quality, but also regulatory standards that we need to comply with. And we know there's a whole host of labor legislation. Wellington has reminded us, the Labor Relations Act, the Basic Condition Employment Act, Employment Equity Act, Occupational Health and Safety. So there's so many different, we even have the POPI Act recently that we need to comply with. So I think that should be the objectives.
So in concluding episode 6, we've looked at the HR functional governance model and then also looked at the HR governance architecture as proposed by myself, looking at the R-E-D-C-A-R framework. So when we incorporate these two frameworks, we need to look at an implementation process, and probably the best framework that I can recommend is that by the Scholar Grobler 2014 model. And in particular, if we look at the subcomponents of the HR leadership component as it's cascaded down from corporate to HR governance to the HR leadership actions in particular, there are 5: strategic alignment of HR risk management and internal controls, HR process management, HR transformation, which has been one of the golden threads which that have unified all of the series episodes thus far, but also HR quality assurance. And collectively, when we collate them, that leads to HR intelligence and reporting. And you'll recall from episode 5, we did look at HR metrics and scorecarding. And I think this is a very important inclusion as a key performance area in your HR scorecard. So this is Dr. Charles Cotter signing out. Again, I'd like to say thank you for your time investment in viewing this short video clip on HR governance. I'd also at this point encourage you to subscribe to my YouTube learning channel. If you enjoyed the video, please click on the like button. Please ring the bell for notifications of upcoming learning content, in particular episode 7, which is the seventh and final episode of this series, which will then look at HR auditing, in particular the auditing principles, but also I will navigate you through the HR auditing process. You'll also find me very active on social media, so please connect with me on LinkedIn or Twitter or Facebook. And certainly, like I've said in previous episodes, my portfolio of SlideShare presentations is available on the SlideShare platform. Also, if you have any questions or comments regarding this particular video clip, please post those in the comment section. I will gladly respond to them. Thanks a lot. I hope to catch up with you for the seventh and final episode of the HRM Strategic Performance Advisor video series. Thank you. Bye-bye.